And here we have Dr. Ken Clark. And you're not Dr. Chris Meng yet, right?
Not yet. Maybe one day.
We'll maybe see. One day. And of course, I'm Tony Holler, and we have Chris Corfist. And I know after watching Ken's presentation today, it connected so many of the dots from, I'd watched Chris Corfist's presentation last week, and now I'm going to have to watch it again because it all fit together so good. So anyway, welcome, Ken, and tell everybody who you are.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Happy to be a part of my third TFC here, and really appreciate you guys having me and Chris here to talk about all things speed. I'm in my 6th year as a faculty member at Westchester University. My background, I was a small college football player who was not very fast, always trying to get faster. That kind of led to my interest in speed and sports performance. Served as a strength and conditioning coach for a better part of a decade before getting into research and academics, and did my PhD with Dr. Peter Wayne and Dr. Larry Ryan down at Southern Methodist University in Dallas from 2010 to 2015. Was lucky enough just to study the science of speed there for 5 years. And as I said, been at Westchester now since 2015, and I kind of a nice, fun hybrid role. I teach classes in biomechanics and motor learning, so basically coaching science, if you will, and do research in biomechanics, sprint mechanics, and then I'm also a volunteer assistant coach with the track team. So I coach the sprinters and the speed and power athletes, and want to give a shout out to our head coach, Jason Kilgore. Does a great job running our track program, and nice enough to let me help out. So
now, Ken, aren't you a coach's kid as well?
I am, yeah. So apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I guess. My dad is a biomedical researcher who was also a small college football player, and he coached high school football for a long time, and got athletes faster. He did speed training before it was really a thing in the high school football level. So he was doing this all the way since the really the late 80s, early 90s. I always joke my interest in overspeed came because I was doing bungee cord overspeed at the age of 8 in 1988, and with my dad running and pulling the bungee ahead of me. So we were playing around with things way back then, way in the TFC spirit, I guess, of experimenting with things and kind of some non-traditional methods. So come by it naturally.
So Chris, if you only have one question tonight, what's it going to be for Dr. Ken Clark?
Well, see, that doesn't work because Ken and I talked earlier and we've got this all planned out.
All right, take over.
This is all, we had discussions. So for people who don't know, Ken and I have known each other for a while. We've actually done a research project together. He did most of the work. I just showed up. But we talk frequently. We kind of bounce ideas off of each other. And if you saw my presentation, Ken's really my crack dealer who feeds me ideas because he knows I'll follow through on them and test them out, and then I'll come back and say yes or no, and then he uses that to go on to see if it's going to work or not. And Ken won't deny that either. See how he's laughing because he knows he's got me on the hook.
Officially for Westchester University records, I am not a crack dealer.
So we talked earlier today because we've been going back and forth about this and about our presentations as well, because we've watched each other's presentations and we had comments for each other. So I had some thoughts watching through it, and so we kind of came up with some ideas of where we want to go with this. Just it doesn't mean people can't chime in and ask questions and things like that, but I thought and Ken would agree that I posed some good questions based on what I saw and where we're at. So I'm going to start with this, and this is one that we kind of differed on, so it might be testy. Ooh, here comes your social media moment where we might get into a fight. So I'm going to start with this. I think everyone would agree that Peter Wayne's research in 2000 with his concepts on vertical force is kind of like a cornerstone for any modern sprint research, sprint training thoughts. And if you deny what he has done and what he has done since then, then really in my book, I discredit you. I won't listen to anything you have to say because to me, that's what he is to me. And none of us would be here with these ideas about sprinting if there's no Peter Wayand. Like if Peter Wayand decided just to do research on walking for the US Army and what that energy expenditure was, none of us would be here. I mean, I'd still be doing repeat 200s and that kind of work. So Ken worked for Peter for a while. And if you go down to Peter's research land at SMU, there's actually jokes about Ken up on the wall and different things in honor of Ken because of his important work there. But I think this paper is fascinating because it greatly advances what Peter has done. So my question to you, Ken, is how does this advance Peter's work and your work at SMU in relationship to vertical force application and limb mechanics?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. And obviously these are ideas, Chris Corvus, that you and I have been kicking around for really the last couple of years. And for those that aren't, I guess, fully aware of some of Peter Wayand's research over the last really 20 years at this point. So as Chris mentioned, in the year 2000, he came out with a really kind of paradigm shifting research study on the role of vertical forces and ground contact times and during top speed sprinting. And then there was a follow-up study to that in 2010, kind of along the same lines. And those two studies were, hugely important, as Chris just alluded to, for kind of outlining, I would say, the what of faster speeds. Basically, what do faster runners do in comparison to their slower counterparts? And the what is more vertical force and shorter ground contact times. I mean, if you had to boil it down to kind of two things, it would be that.
And let me jump in real quick, because up to that point, and I was at Peter's speech at North Central College in 2000 during a snowstorm, as was Dan Fichter, who I know is here with us tonight. He made a great speech explaining up to this point, everyone had relationships of stride length and stride frequency, and that's how you define speed. And I think what made his research so revolutionary for a small group of nerds who are into this, he basically took that age-old idea that everyone subscribed to and threw it out the window and said, no, this is how it is. And here's my proof.
Yeah,
So
no doubt.
Sorry.
No, absolutely. It's a great point. I mean, paradigm shifting or perspective shifting or whatever you want to say, but both researchers and coaches, I think who understood that research said, wow, this is a new way of looking at things. And it's not just, okay, well, what's the athlete's stride rate or their stride length, but it's, how much force are they applying down into the ground? And it's, it's so rooted just in kind of Newton's laws and that sort of thing. It's just great science. So in those two studies, it really shifted the way people looked at top speed sprinting and said, okay, well, really the cause of this is how much force athletes are applying, how much vertical force, so force down into the ground relative to how much they weigh, or what you could term mass specific force. And that just means how much force relative to your body mass. When I was there in 2010 to 2015, I was really super lucky for a number of reasons. But when I got down there in 2010, I landed and Peter basically said to me, okay, your research question for your dissertation for these next 5 years is going to be, how are these faster runners applying more force? We've already established the what, more vertical force and shorter contact times, but how, why, and how are they doing this? So for 5 years, along with Peter and Larry Ryan, we just got to investigate that. And, that included testing over 100 people on the instrumented force treadmill, literally gold medal winning sprinters, some of the fastest people to ever live, team sport athletes like Division I athletes, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and average Joes. And we found that, the high rates of vertical force application came from the way they were winding up and striking the ground. So basically the classic high knee lift that we're all familiar with of faster runners, sets up to really aggressively attack the ground, and with a stiff ground contact results in higher rates of vertical force application, allows for the shorter contact times and the faster speeds. And so kind of the place that this more recent research comes in from the Westchester University Human Performance Lab that And Dan Fichter, yes, that ended with you running on ice. Absolutely. That and that was, what's so funny about that, Dan, is when I got down to the lab in 2010, I saw that video. Like in the first year that I was there, I saw that video. That's hilarious.
So I think it might be on YouTube. I think it's Iceman Runneth or something like that, where Dan rented a hockey rink to prove this correct. Put carpet.
He ran on. He accelerated not on ice, right?
He accelerated on carpet, hit ice, ran a third of the ice rink, which was probably 6 strides, and then got onto the carpet again. He thought he was going to die. And Dan has a sincere fear of death. So to get Dan to do something scary is a pretty big thing.
Okay. As we used to say down in the lab in Texas, cowboy science at its best right there. So this latest research basically took it one step further up the chain, literally and figuratively. And so looked not just kind of at what was happening, while the foot's on the ground during the ground contact time, but really what's going on at the thigh throughout the course of the entire stride cycle, and saying, okay, well, it ends in people attacking the ground and being able to apply large forces, which then ultimately results in faster speed. But what are they doing to set that up? And again, we all kind of intuitively as coaches or athletes know that, okay, hey, good knee lift, good front side mechanics, that results it, or that's what good sprinters look like, I should say. But what we looked at was thigh angular velocity is what it's technically called in kind of biomechanical terms, and basically saying, okay, the faster the limbs can rotate throughout the course of the stride cycle, then the faster the foot velocity is going to be at ground contact, both down and back. And I'm sure we'll get into this conversation in a little bit, but again, to kind of get into some trig, that would be like tangential foot velocity. So really the faster the foot's going to end up moving down and back. The more of that you have, the better. The more the faster the foot's going down and back, the better that's going to be for speed. And from a vertical force standpoint, it all kind of starts up at the hip. The faster the thighs rotate, the faster the foot ends up striking the ground. You combine that with a stiff ground contact, you're going to apply a lot of force in a little time, and you're going to run really fast.
And I think with that concept, because people will ask this question, well, how does so-and-so in the NFL run a 4.40 but they have terrible form? Well, it's because of this factor. When the turnover is so great that they have to run fast. And I think you can see it when you see someone come out of a cut, right, and you see them accelerate and their form is horrible. You're like, but man, they're moving. It's because of that turnover. And so if you look at it from that perspective, it answers a lot of the questions where people are going to say, yeah, but. And I said, but look at this and just watch with your eyes what their turnover is. And that explains it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if we look at, elite sprinters in a 100-meter dash, more of them than not are going to be, up tall, have good front side mechanics, all the things that we classically, think of when we think of sprinting. But to your point, Chris, I mean, there's going to be people in a game sport situation who aren't going to, exemplify those mechanics. But if they have, really really fast thigh angular velocity, even if they're not totally up tall and, illustrating classic sprint like mechanics, they're still going to be able to apply a lot of force and run really fast. I want to bring Chris Meng in here really quickly for kind of an important add-on. So this is a key kind of distinction in terminology that we really came to during the course of this research, and then even after this research. So Chris, this is a stride frequency versus thigh angular velocity. So there's some differences between just turnover or stride frequency, which is a pretty common coaching term, obviously, and what we're talking about here with thigh angular velocity. And it seems like it's not an important distinction, but actually it is. So Chris Meng, if you're comfortable chiming in here, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, definitely. That's like a big point on like drills that we were looking for with Jordan at the end of our presentation too, was drills to kind of increase or overload like the angular velocity as opposed to just frequency. So the big thing there, and like what we were talking about with like those athletes that look fast without the great form, is they're like the range of motion that they go through is also really important. So being able to have like that big range of motion and go through it quickly. is kind of the distinguishing factor, as opposed to just quickly moving around your limbs. So that's like, think about athletes get the big split. If they pull it back, like the ballistic force is going to be a lot more than if they were coming from like a shorter distance.
The extreme example there would be like a quick foot ladder, which is obviously on social media everybody's favorite target, right? But quick foot ladder has high stride frequency. I mean, right? I mean, the stride frequency is high, but the thigh angular velocity and, oh, by the way, the force is nothing. I'm not picking on the quick foot ladder. I mean, time and place for everything, whatever. But I mean, that's the ultimate example of the difference between stride frequency and thigh angular velocity. So thigh angular velocity is how fast are you going through the range of motion. And to tie on to Chris Korfist's presentation, when we look at those, you know, the split between the thighs at the instant of peak flexion and extension, you got to go through that big split and go through that quickly to have really high thigh angular velocity. Sorry, guys.
And if you want to see a perfect speed ladder guy, Cal Dietz posted this a day or two ago, where there was some guy who was supposed to be great on the ladder. He's got all kinds of social media, and he was at an NFL tryout, and they showed him going through the traditional back pedal where you look one side, look the other side, and then turn. It literally looked like he was doing speed ladder. So his feet were going a million miles an hour, but he wasn't going anywhere. And you hear a coach in the background go, "Oh, that's not good."
Ken, I have a question about,
Yeah.
okay, so you get the big split, and obviously you want to have the good velocity as well. I kept wondering when I was seeing your stuff today, if possibly the big split contributes to the faster velocity because of some, you know, like when I would teach a young quarterback how to throw, I would tell them to spread the chest, you know, that we want to stretch the chest in order to throw the ball better. So when you bring that knee up high and you're at 110 or 150 degrees or 115 degrees, I'm sorry, does that improve the velocity of the thighs?
That is a tremendous question. I've never been asked that, Tony. You know, it's like what we teach our students in biomechanics class about doing the whole finger, that thing, right? I mean, it's essentially how you have some elastic elements in your musculotendinous system. So I don't know the answer to that. I think there's parts of that thigh angular velocity, and this is just pure speculation on my part, that are, you know, some that are reflexive, and then some that are probably, you know, I'm not sure if I would say volitional, but I guess I don't know. I think that the cause and effect is tough to tease out there. I think if you went back and looked at some of the old classic coaches like Tom Tellez, they would probably, you know, say that lots of that is reflexive in nature, to your point, and that if you can get a little bigger split, maybe then it, you know, from an elastic standpoint, it springs back, if you will. When I wear my researcher hat, I always like to sit on the fence with some answers if I don't wholly know the truth. So I'm going to sit on the fence on that one. Great question. Never been asked that. I think teasing out the chicken and the egg of that, you know, is kind of one of the places where we could potentially take this kind of to the next level. I would bet that Chris would have some insight there. I mean, some of the drills from his presentation as well, Chris Korfist there, some of the drills from your presentation, Chris, you know, were relying kind of on reflexes, you know, so I'm going to forget the names of them, where he got them into the big splits and then they were being pulled down to the ground and kind of forced them to basically scissor the legs back, you know, faster than they normally would.
Yeah, we did that with the I call them marshals,
right? Yeah.
And yeah, you've got to get your legs down fast. And again, the goal is that split and how fast you can bring it down. One quick coaching tip on that: make sure that when you're doing those, that your chest stays up. I see a lot of people that are going to break at their waist and they're going to bring their chest forward. And a lot of people do that whenever you're doing any kind of knee work or knee lift work. Most average athletes will break at the waist because they want to do well. So by dropping their horizon, they think the knee is actually coming higher, and actually you're training to do something that's a lot worse. So make sure, I always say, lead with your heart. And so you're going to push your heart forward when you do this. And then if you think about it, it turns into a kangaroo, because what do kangaroos always lead with? They lead with their heart when they bounce, right?
Interesting.
So that's the coaching point when doing those marshals. And so Uh, thank God someone did video it. We put blue bands on Marshall, the heavy ones, to do them. And I got thrown on my back. He jumped up so hard that my leg my old man moment where I wasn't strong enough to hold him, and he flipped me onto my back.
Powerful guy. Hey, Tony, your question also brought up one other point that I wanted to make, because I actually forgot to mention this in my presentation. Chris Corfus and I were discussing this today as well. So what we've found is that optimal split in the fastest runners, this is not only in our data set, we started to look at it in some of the USA track and field people that I'm lucky enough to work with, is roughly 105 degrees, that split between the thighs, plus or minus about 5. I mean, there's bandwidth, there's acceptable variation in everything we do from a technical standpoint, but really most of those elites are going to be somewhere between 100 and 110, so 105 plus or minus 5. Not too many of the elites have been less than 100.
Was Michael Johnson an outlier, or did it just seem that way?
So I'm going to let Chris Corfus speak to that one.
So when Ken and I started talking about this, there's a slide in my presentation where I show it. I grabbed 6 people, and I didn't grab Noah Lyles, because Noah Lyles is definitely an outlier, because Ken thinks he's 115.
I measured him about just off the TV screen on pause, about 114, 115. But yeah.
So here's where it gets crazy. And Ken and I had a long discussion about this afternoon. Michael Johnson is not an outlier. Michael Johnson actually has a great split. The one who doesn't have a great split is Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt would be on the short side of that range, and Michael Johnson would be on the far side of that range.
Depending on where you look at it, and in some of the frames that we've looked at, that's probably true. Bolt's an outlier with everything, is always my comment when people, look at Bolt to be a technical model, because I'm always like, well, he's the only guy at 6'5" who could rotate the levers that fast. So I never necessarily look at him to be the norm. But yeah, I think Johnson surprised me going back to that point more than anything, just because Tony, to your point, would have perhaps think of him as being, really constricted and tight in the way he ran, or through a smaller range of motion, I guess would probably be a better way to look at it. But Chris has that slide in his presentation, and I was like, wow, I would not have guessed that. And
here's why I think Michael Johnson may be an outlier. So his incredibly erect posture could be that is the stabilization that his body needs to get to that split, to feel comfortable. And I think his split reverses so fast that it just looks like it doesn't go very far. That is from the film that I broke down and looked at, that's what it was to me. And if you look at it from a neural standpoint, again, Dan Fichter, if you want to jump in here, you can. The more safe your spine feels, the more range of motion that your body's going to give that split. Again, that gets down to the heart. Can I lead with my heart? So and what does Michael Johnson do when he runs? He's leading with his heart, isn't he?
Did he have incredible angular velocity then?
I'd have to go back and dig up films from 92 to 96 and give it the old once over. It's a little bit tough. We need you need some relatively high speed video to give it a decent assessment. So probably the television footage from those days would be a little bit tough to interpret. But I mean, I bet it's not bad. I'll put it that way.
So Dan Fichter's saying that's pretty true, that the spine feels safe and it's going to give that range of motion. That I think that if you tried to change Michael Johnson, say, don't be so erect, you would drastically change his stride. And that's just the way his body worked. But looking at it from the films that I got, that's what I saw. And then I think what's also interesting is the girls. I think the girls had some tremendous splits. And then if you go back and you look at some girls that are just okay, even at the high school level, there's no split at all. I mean,
yeah, we found no difference in the elites that we're starting to look at. No difference, male, female. Like literally that 105 degrees is about the same male versus female, plus or minus a little bit. But one interesting point, sorry, Chris Corfus, to cut you off there. But so like normal team sport athlete, it's probably going to be like 90, 95 degrees. And so you might think, well, that's not a big difference, 95 degrees versus 105 degrees. But from a practical standpoint, as far as how that relates to their top speed, that's a big difference. That's like a ground contact time of 0.08 versus 0.12. You may say, well, that's not a big difference, but the reality is, as it relates to top speed, that's a big difference. So if you see a high school kid who's a team sport athlete and you're breaking down his film from the side and you draw in the angles and it's roughly a right angle between his two thighs, well, the reality is that's probably not a big enough range of motion, at least based on kind of some of the normative data that we're starting to establish on faster athletes. Again, chicken and egg, cause and effect may be a little bit hard to tease out, but as far as what you're looking for, so to speak, for what the faster athletes are doing, it definitely seems to be 100 degrees or more.
And then with endurance athletes, like cross-country kids that never sprint, that are like mileage-based runners, they can't even get to that position. They can't even get to 90.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with some of the training applications, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, it's important not to try to force athletes into ranges of motion that their body can't do. If they have physical limitations, that sort of thing. So it's important to, I guess, evaluate the hardware first, if you will, to make sure that they don't have mobility restrictions that are preventing them from hitting those angles, that sort of thing, before working on the software. One thing to, I guess, just keep in mind on kind of a more applied front. But
I think from a beginner standpoint, or even an intermediate standpoint, doing split squat drops where you jump off the side of a box and you work on getting that range of motion, I think that's why that's so important for those athletes. Because in a falling situation, your body's going to do what it feels the safest. And so you'll take an athlete like a distance runner and drop them off, and you say, well, geez, Jimmy, your legs are this far apart, and that's where they felt safe. So if you put them in this reflexive moment where they got to protect themselves, that's when you can start to work it out so their body feels safe, because now they fall, they land in a wider split. The body's saying, hey, it's okay to be here. We can be here now.
What would that look like, Chris?
So you're going to stand on the side of a box, and then you swing your outside leg, and then you jump down. Outside leg comes forward, and you land into a lunge. The best athletes I've seen have had a great long split without banging their knee off the ground. But that's a good basic and intermediate drill that you can use to get people to neurologically accept the fact that you can get to that point. And then from that point, you can go into a Marshall jump, because like what I saw this fall when I went to like 20 days of practice, and all the younger kids, you ask them to do a Marshall jump, they couldn't do it. And it's like, well, why? Well, neurologically, they can't get there. They don't know what that's like. But yet I'm expecting them to run a 1 flat fly 10 or something like that.
And what does the Marshall jump look like again?
You jump up and you get into that lunge position. So it's basically how far can you split in the air and then come back down.
And do you jump out of the lunge position again?
Oh, we do it all different ways. But basically you're going to start from 2, or now we're on 1 foot. We jump up and split and land back on that 1 foot. And if you want to jack up your vertical jump, that's a great way to jack up your vertical jump. We had vertical jumps go through the roof doing that exercise. And I don't know why. I had one kid, a sophomore in high school, he did 37. He went from 32 to 37, and all we did was Marshalls. Now, being a sophomore in high school, all he wants to do is banded Marshall jumps. And it's like, Michael, come on, we can move away from this now. Now come on, coach, I'll just do them on the side. I'll just do them on the side when no one's looking. All right, fine. If you really want to do them, go do them. If you think it's going to help you that much. So moving on, next step. So we've got that angular velocity come down, and then we get into contact with stiffness. And I think that's the next step that some people have, not everyone, but a lot of people question the importance of stiffness when you sprint. And I think, first of all, I think it's important that we define this. And by the way, Tony, this is hot in my mind because I'm almost done with your video on stiffness for your series. I worked on it
Good.
the last couple
But
days.
before you go on, the way I have defined it before is the opposite of collapsing. Is that, would you think that that'd be a?
Yeah, 100%. I'll chime in here. Hey, Chris Meng, heads up. When I'm done, I'll kick it over to you, and maybe you can just talk about what you did with Jordan to work on stiffness training, if that works. But so Tony and Chris Corfist, I mean, from a physics standpoint, which is where I always start at physics and biomechanics. Yeah, I mean, you're looking at peak force divided by peak vertical displacement, right? So how much force you're applying down divided by how much vertical displacement is just how much is your center mass collapsing, Tony. So to be really stiff, just in a pure biomechanics sense, it means there's lots of vertical force, applying a lot of vertical force down and not collapsing a lot. Think of like a really stiff spring. You can push really hard on it and it's not gonna compress at all. If you have a non-stiff spring, a really compliant spring, just with a little bit of force, that slinky mushes together, right? So from a stiffness standpoint, I mean, I can talk about the research first, but then I'll just talk as a coach. I mean, the research is conclusive. Faster runners are stiffer from a vertical stiffness. There's some other ways you can define it called leg spring stiffness. I'm not going to get into that. From its simplest form, vertical stiffness is associated with running speed. Faster runners have greater vertical stiffness. They're applying greater peak forces and they're having less compliance or compression. To me, that's important not only to understand the basic biomechanics, that's important from a coaching standpoint as well. If I'm looking at an athlete, whether it's a sprinter or a team sport athlete, it doesn't matter. If they strike the ground and they, collapse, I think, Tony, as you just said a minute ago, if they collapse, if they mush into the ground, to use a less scientific word, that's a problem. Because if they're collapsing into the ground, if they're not stiff, that's going to prolong ground contact time. And if it's prolonging ground contact time, it's going to slow them down. The daisy chain of thoughts is as simple as that. If you're not stiff, you're on the ground longer. And if you're on the ground longer, you're slower. And it's basically as simple as that. So not only
research, yeah. I'm sorry, Ken. Ken's research shows that in his paper on the 40-yard dash, and he's showing the difference between an elite runner and an average runner. That spike at the beginning of contact is that moment of stiffness.
Yeah, the research we did with thanks for the shout out there, Chris. The papers with Peter and Larry Ryan at SMU that looked at the vertical force curve. I mean, the high rates of vertical force in the beginning portion of ground contact, that is when the sprinters were being stiffer than the team sport athletes. I mean, more force and they're compressing not as much. One little nerdy side note here. Everyone thinks that maybe people really collapse during ground contact. The fastest runners in the world, their center of mass decreases during ground contact less than an inch, less than 2.5 centimeters. Like, you really should not be collapsing hardly at all during ground contact. So if you see a runner, team sport or sprinter, and they're collapsing into the ground at the foot, at the ankle, at the knee, that's a challenge. That's a problem. And I'll say one more thing before I kick it over to Chris Meng. Stiffness at the knee, and this is potentially another area that for research, you got to be stiff at the knee during ground contact. If you bend too much at the knee, the hip can't extend. I know this is tough to visualize. If the knee's bending, then the thigh isn't extending. And if the thigh's not extending, then you're not propelling yourself down the track. Then you can't, get through that ground contact phase. So you got to be stiff all the way up the chain. Foot, ankle, knee, hip, just all the way up the chain. So Tony, I hope that aligns with kind of how you were defining it and what you were getting at in your thoughts from the other day. So I certainly have my thoughts on the best ways to train it. I don't necessarily think they need to be complicated per se, but Chris Meng, why don't you dive in here?
Yeah, so Jordan was definitely one of those mushier athletes. She definitely collapsed when we first started doing a lot of sprint work or a lot of plyo work. And I liked what you said there, Dr. Clark, about like the different segments involved. So something we did, we like kind of broke it up into each piece of the puzzle really. So like we did the ankle plyometrics, we like the pogo jumps. Those are like great bang for your buck drill. We did a lot of single leg bounds. So that'd be like your knee plyometrics. And then Chris, I think Cal Dietz had a good video a while ago about like his hip plyometrics that he did, where he like tied athletes down to the racks with the bands. We wanted to try those. We never had like the equipment to set it up, because you have to weigh them down pretty heavy, but it's pretty similar to the Marshalls, it looks like. So that could be like the hip stiffness drills for sure. And then I think a big thing for Jordan too was we did a lot of overspeed. So like we said, like being able to like increase the speed, shorten those ground contact times, and have to deal with larger average forces, definitely I think had a big impact on like the ability to stay stiff, especially when you go back to volitional running.
For those
not
that
a shout out to
watch-
me and Ken, but that's what our overspeed paper proved that nobody read.
for those that don't know the backstory, the one of the ways that I got involved with this great crew was, well, I guess at the first TFC, but then after that, it was coming out to Chicago and doing a study on overspeed with Chris Corfist's 1080, and the TFC crew out rallied the troops as far as getting athletes and coaches to come out over a 2-day period. It was really phenomenal. The number and quality of athletes we had. Chris Meng was an athlete in that study. The amount of speed that we had there for those 2 days was really stunning, considering everyone was just a volunteer and an amateur. I mean, there's no professional athletes there, but that was it was really a stunning outpouring of turnout from the coaches and the athletes. And yes, I'm forever grateful. And that was a really good study, and first exposure to 1080 and some of the things that it can do. Switching back to the stiffness real quick, for those of you that watched our presentation at the end, I didn't take time to go into comprehensive every drill you can do to train stiffness, but I just took two of the simplest and most popular, especially popular in the TFC crowd. So just one leg, bunny hops or pogo jumps. And I had the sprinter do that on the force plate, and also just boom booms, the thigh switches on a force plate. And what's really interesting, for those that don't know, so the ground contact times in sprinting are really fast. Even if you're average runner, you're on and off the ground in 0.12 seconds. And if you're good, you're on and off the ground in less than 1/10 of a second, literally faster than the blink of an eye. So there's no plyometric that can match that short ground contact time. And that's not a knock on plyometrics at all. I love plyometrics. We do them with our athletes at Westchester, et cetera. But that's just kind of the facts. There's no plyo that can match that short contact time. But I was interested in just, are there plyometrics that can match the stiffness demands of sprinting? How much peak force with how little displacement? So just for some pilot data, again, this wasn't an official research study, but I brought that same subject, that athlete, the competitive sprinter who was in all of our videos in the lab, and on the force plates just had him do some one leg pogo hops and then some boom booms where only one leg was hitting the plate. And what was pretty incredible was, although as predicted, the ground contact times were longer than sprinting, that was no surprise, but the stiffnesses were approaching sprinting. Just from a one leg pogo hop, it was basically equivalent to sprinting. Not quite as much for the boom booms, but still, when they're executed right, you're getting high levels of stiffness. For me, that there's important practical applications twofold. Number one, need to be a little bit cautious, I guess, with developmental athletes before having them go to a one leg pogo hop, because those are perhaps higher levels of stiffness than we might expect. But the good sort of that, or the good other side of that coin, is you don't need a difficult drill to challenge stiffness. I mean, a one leg pogo hop is going to get really high levels of stiffness, is going to be really effective for training that sort of thing. Same with a boom boom. As I think I said in that video, I mean, in this crowd, I think we all love thigh switches in some form or fashion. And that was pretty cool little pilot evidence to back that up.
So after we get to the stiffness moment, then a lot starts to happen. And I think this is where it gets interesting, because that's where your ankle has to take up a lot of what's going on. And I think it's important to note that you're going to get stiff somewhere. that somewhere along the line, something is going to lock down or tighten up your tendons and ligaments. I think that's where, again, the contact time is going to come into play, that if you've got a hip that bounces out, or you twist a different way, or even if your spine is curved in a funny way, that's going to increase your contact time, because you're trying to dissipate the force that's making its way up to your neck, and you don't want to break your neck. And again, so that, again, the whole body stiffness and the whole co-contraction idea of the body when it hits the ground is key. But then after that, that's where ankle should come into play. And that's where ankle rocker comes into play. And then if you want to look at more horizontal force when you follow through, that's where your forefoot rocker comes in. But I think I want to note here that a lot of that comes from the speed, that the harder or the faster that leg snaps down into the ground, the ankle has to give. Otherwise, you're going to get hurt. And neurologically, if you can't get there, again, that's why I use RPRs to get there neurologically, but that's what's going to be the movement through the whole system.
Yeah, I think it's really key to, the wind up and the strike is really what's kind of come out of just this entire last 10 years of research, kind of, hopefully culminating in this most recent study. What the best sprinters do is they really get themselves in great position to wind up and then attack the ground. And then it's attack the ground, all the way through ground contact, and then propel themselves in, into the next flight phase, and then wind up and do it all over again.
And the faster that leg comes in, the harder the tendon system is going to wind up and be a better spring.
Now, Chris, one of the things that I didn't hear in Ken's presentation, and I'll just get right to it, the idea of the dorsiflexed foot. I mean, coaches, even coaches that aren't very good sprint coaches, love to yell dorsiflex, dorsiflex. Is that overused? Is that a cue that needs to be retired, or is that important?
My opinion or Ken's?
Yours first.
Not important.
Interesting.
And here's why. When your foot hits the ground, you're trying to create, well, first of all, we got to create a spring, right? If it's locked, there's no absorption of the force to dissipate up the line. So if you hit, if I punched you like this and I hit it wrong, I'm going to break my wrist. Now, if we're looking at tangential force, it's going to come down. There's got to be some moment where you're going to load the spring. So if I come down and it's already loaded, I'm going to dump it up, and it's going to be too long. It's never going to make its way back. It's going to happen too fast before that force comes out. So personally, I do not teach dorsiflexion. I think your body is going to put the ankle where it feels the safest. And if I go ahead and I coach that in, I'm coaching for an injury. The body knows where it's going to go.
Nobody is plantar flexed. That would be, you don't even have to tell people, don't be like toe first.
No,
I would chime in here and say, in my opinion, it depends on the population, because what I see from a lot of soccer players, I would slightly disagree in the sense that with a lot of soccer players that I've worked with, they, not like ballerinas per se, but more plantar flex than a sprinter would be for sure. So I think for certain populations that can be an important cue. Now, look, everybody's going to plantar flex a tiny bit before contact. I think for some populations more so than other, though, the striking on a stiff part of the ball of the, striking stiff on the ball of the foot can be an important cue. I think when you're looking at better sprinters, they're probably doing that naturally. So how much bang for your buck you get out of that cue may be limited. With some of the team sport athletes I've worked with over the years, they're doing a number of things wrong. And there's probably more important cues like posture and hip position. Like I've worked with some Division III soccer teams where it's just like, oh man, they got like 5 different things going wrong here at their top speed mechanics. So maybe that's not the first thing you're addressing.
The soccer players are the worst group to work with.
But I don't know, linebackers can be bad
permanently.
too. But I will say in that population, I've seen some foot mechanics where if their posture and their hips had been corrected, where I would cue a more, I would never use the term dorsiflexed with them, but I would say, hey, don't run like a ballerina, run like a sprinter, so something like that. So at least implying that. So
see, I don't want it locked. I don't want that joint mortise where there's not going to be an absorption. I think when that toe catches, especially if you got spikes on, you're starting to load the chain.
And
And as you roll through,
that locked foot, Chris, I've heard coaches say that is a loaded spring, and you're saying it's not.
no, because what energy has loaded the spring? You can't consciously load a spring. It's got to come, and there's no energy. If I pull it back, I mean, think about this. If I go to press here, there's not a lot, but if I get a spring, it's going to work a lot better. And I think that's just part of the system, that it's built to be that way, to load. But if you've already loaded it, it's not going to work. And I think the ground, like Dan Fictor's chiming in here, the ground reaction forces will overpower a simple dorsiflexor.
Yeah,
again,
there's no doubt
I don't want to jam that. I need that to be protective too. I don't want to override my neural function of protection of that ankle, because remember, in the hierarchy of things, you're always going to protect before you perform. And if I force something into something that I'm not ready to do, that's where my injury comes. And I think personally, when you're consciously trying to drive something like that, you're going to have a decrement in performance.
I'll tie a bow on it like this. I mean, clearly, Dan, to the point you just made, the impact forces that occur. I mean, people go into dorsiflexion, as the foot, yields under the ground reaction forces during the first part of contact. There's no doubt that happens to everybody. Elite sprinter, D3 soccer player, whatever. I think my point was more, if you're punching with a too compliant an ankle, obviously this being the physical analogy to the foot striking the ground. If a soccer player is striking here and we can get them to strike a little bit more there, then potentially you get more of that high rate of vertical force earlier on in a ground contact phase. So I don't know, stiffness is defining what optimal stiffness is a tricky thing. You don't want to be compliant. When people mush into the ground, that's not a good thing. There needs to be some give, I guess, some yield. So, but you certainly can't be mushing. There can't be too much.
Right. And I think part of what happens with stiffness is just a complete co-contraction, because your body knows from development that 3 to 4 times my body weight is coming down, and everything's going to lock down for that moment. And that moment is, 0.25 milliseconds, where everything locks. And Ken and I were joking about this earlier, because some people said, well, we're not sure about stiffness. That's what I get for the one time I go on social media and I see someone say that. My point would be this: when JL goes to bench press 800 pounds and they hand him off the 800 pounds, if anything in JL's body doesn't co-contract, 800 pounds falls on his face. And if you think about it, JL's got to be 400 pounds. That's only twice his body weight. Dan's going to laugh now because we always give JL crap about being big. But triple that now. There's going to be that's where that co-contraction comes into play, that everything locks down for a moment. And then after that point, certain things are going to let go as it rolls through.
And since we're in the subject of the dorsiflex foot, when we are at the maximum angle, should the shin be vertical?
At what angle? Give me a point.
In a split, you're talking?
Yeah, like in a typical Carl Lewis pose, I call it the, getting big, where your angle is at maximum. A lot of my runners will have their foot trailing behind their knee a little bit. And from the fastest guys I've ever seen, they have a vertical shin when they're in that position. Agree or no?
So yeah, really interesting question again. Typically those things are going to line up pretty well in that the shin's basically going to be vertical when the thigh is at its highest point. In fact, one of the things we've been doing our USA track and field analysis on this that we look for, and Chris Corfus, I think when you and I were first getting into how to draw in these angles on video, it's when the shin angle kicks out, when the foot basically kicks out past the knee, is when the thigh starts to drop. So Tony, I think to answer your question, what's good versus, like what should it be versus what it is, I'm not sure there, but the bottom line is that maximal split will basically occur when the front shin is vertical, give or take just a little bit. I think Chris and Chris, that probably jives with the video analysis you guys have done, or chime in if it doesn't, but that's typically what I've seen with most. One thing that I'll also chime in with is you can see what I would call like a fake high knee. So if the shin is kicked out where the foot is almost past the knee at the instant of toe off, not at the instant of max split, but at the instant where the other foot is toeing off the ground, then they're just running pretty. Then they're just doing, this high knee or overly front side run, because then they're not projecting at all. So in other words, it's important actually, Tony, to your point, that shin isn't going vertical until they're probably, 0.02 seconds into flight or into the first part of flight. If that shin is vertical and their back foot is still touching the ground, that actually means that they're not projecting. They're not covering any ground at all. I don't know if that makes sense without some visuals to describe that, but Chris and Chris, you guys want to chime in there? Does that make sense what I said?
Sure. And I think another important part is if you're looking at velocities of legs, the carriage through. So the swing leg coming through, that speed's really important. And so how do we slow that down? You lengthen the levers. So the more you let that shin dangle, the more energy it's going to take to come through, and the slower velocity it's going to have to come through. And the slower velocity, it's not going to have the speed to get to the height that you need it to at extension.
I don't understand that.
So if you look at a great sprinter,
angle thing.
So let's say you look at a great sprinter and you're looking at the swing leg. I'm looking at the angle between the calf and the hamstring. The tighter that is, the less energy it's going to take to swing that through. Therefore, I can use more velocity. So okay. I think that's one important aspect of training a lot of people miss is we never work on that. But if we're looking at velocities or for velocities, we need to work on shutting that down. So I have all these half-written papers. I'm writing a paper on the genetics of sprinting. I think that's one of the main factors of what makes you a good sprinter genetically is if you've got this enormous calf and you can't close that angle off at all, you can't run fast just from a physics standpoint. But if you look at these huge guys that are playing on Sunday, whether it's an offensive lineman, defensive linebacker, they don't have huge calves. And that may be important to get that leg through. And maybe that's why you can have crappy running form and still run a 4.6 at 240 pounds. Because it comes down to physics. And I think everyone here right now agrees that physics always wins. You can't have loose physics and get away with explaining something.
So this is kind of weird. Let me see if I can show this. Can you see it?
Yeah.
So are you talking about, Chris?
All right, I'm going to pull up a better one.
Okay.
How am I going to share my screen? Let me see here.
Go to share screen.
I think I'm in control. Thank you. Oh, I'm in control.
I put you in control tonight.
I feel good about that. Give me a second to look this up. Let me see if I can find one here.
Tony, while Chris is doing that, I don't know if you can scroll through on that video you had pulled up there to the instant of peak split, basically. Or no, I don't know. Is that that was close. Yeah, that's basically it. And as soon as the foot goes past the knee, as soon as the shin goes beyond parallel, then the thigh is going to start to drop. So typically what we look for, like our USATF athletes, is that shouldn't happen right away after takeoff. If that thigh starts to drop the instant the runner takes off into the air, that's a problem because now they can't wind up and strike the ground. So we want that to, obviously, I think that's Marcellus. Obviously, his mechanics are pretty good. That should happen well into the flight phase that they're hitting that that peak split, basically.
Yeah, and he was, I always said he was the stiffest. If there was somebody who only collapsed by 1 centimeter, it might have
It was
been him.
him. Yeah.
Because just incredible stiffness, and it partly is due to his extreme strength and his very low body weight, 149 pounds.
That's right. His mass specific forces, without knowing what they were, from a force plate, I'm guessing they were pretty high.
I bet you they're really high. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'll find it another time. But the tighter that is, I mean, think about a flamingo. When they bring their leg up and stand, that's a tight carriage. And that's what you want, because it's less energy. And that's why you have really good 200-meter runners. You don't expend nearly as much energy to carry that leg through. But if you've got this enormous calf, that's a shit ton of energy that you need, not only to carry it through, but then to stop it as well, because you have all this momentum flowing this way. Now you've got to reverse that. It's like, whoa, how am I going to do that? And so that's where you start to wobble.
Are there outliers out there that can be really long in the back and be super fast and efficient?
Sure.
Yeah, there's outliers to everything, but I think it's more like what's the yeah, exactly. What do most of the fast people do, and what's probably ideal or near optimum for most people. I think anything that's hey, this is the way it's got to be, and there's no outliers is probably not going to be true. As I said about Bolt, I always view Bolt as very much, I mean, he is an outlier, obviously, on a performance spectrum, but even from a technical model standpoint, I mean, if you're looking at, kind of the classic front side mechanics, Bolt's okay, but he's not the best. You would take Asafa Powell or somebody else if you're looking at teaching kind of like the classic front side mechanics over a Bolt. So, yeah, I think there's outliers with everything. But
people forget Asafa Powell is 6'2". He's a big dude.
Yeah.
It's just Bolt's taller.
That's right. Yeah.
All right, Tony, that was one question. That took us an hour to answer one question. Should I move on to question 2?
Sure. Any of the other questions you want to touch on?
Sorry, Ken, this is going to last 6 hours.
All right, since I'm gonna kind of go down this rabbit hole here. What myths in training and sprint things that sprint coaches do exist that science just does not support?
Gosh, yeah. So I guess my number one thing here, and Chris Meng, I'll turn it over to you. This will be a popular answer with the TFC crowd, but I wholeheartedly believe it. It's the team sport athletes who don't reach a peak velocity in the game don't need to train max velocity. And I know this builds right on the same exact concepts that you guys were talking about in last night's discussion. So without piggybacking on that one too much, I mean, I think there's a real disconnect between what GPS data shows, or what sometimes people take out of the analysis of those games that say, well, these athletes never hit top speed in a game situation. And then the conclusions that are drawn from that is, well, therefore we don't need to hit top speed in training. And again, at the risk of kind of reinforcing what was said last night, I mean, there's literally like 5 really important reasons for training top speed that's not perhaps reinforced by the GPS data or whatever else. I mean, from decreasing the risk of injury if it's part of the comprehensive training program, to raising the ceiling on acceleration, to raising the ceiling on speed reserve. My favorite is always, it's just a great training stimulus because it's the most force and the shortest contact time you can get out of anything, as we've already talked about. So as far as I'm not sure if this is specifically something that science supports or doesn't support, but it's just kind of a general concept. I absolutely hate it when I hear that, well, these athletes don't reach top speed in a game, so top speed's not important. I mean, I just think nothing could be further from the truth. And of course I'm biased, and I know that a lot of people in this audience are probably, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir on that one, but I feel strongly about that. I think that in a larger performance coaching population, a lot of people are coming around to that fact that, hey, even if athletes don't hit peak velocity in a game or rarely hit it, that it's, it's still important. And I would say, just look at David Montgomery in Sunday's game, right? So someone here has worked with him. I mean, game-changing plays depend on top speed. Even if guys only hit it once per game, the plays that change game are built on top speed, even if the majority of team sport is acceleration and change of direction. So Chris Meng, why don't you chime in there, and I'll step down from my soapbox. So
I like that a lot. That's something I've said that I've heard you say is like the game, like I heard with the soccer talk yesterday, right? Like 1% of the game is at top speed, less than that, but like that's when a player scores a goal, or that's when a player like makes a save or something like that. So like those plays definitely do matter, and you don't want the first time your athlete's exposed to that to be in the game. That's something you want to be comfortable with before you get there. And just from injury prevention too, that's definitely a big thing. But so yeah, I definitely agree with that.
I want to address one other thing. Again, this is just kind of in my wheelhouse, but I know I'm preaching the choir here. The 40-yard dash, Tony, you had a post on this yesterday, with the miles per hour and a correlation to the 40-yard dash. I mean, our publication a few years ago looked at that same exact thing. It's just, if you want to run a good 40, I mean, you just have to have a good top speed. It's as simple as that. Yeah, yes, you got to have a great start and you got to accelerate, no doubt about it. But our research showed that you're at greater than, certainly greater than 90% of top speed from 20 to 40. So right there, more than half the race is dependent upon what your ceiling is. And even at the 10-yard mark, you're at really high percentages of top speed. I would even go as far as saying from 15 through 40, the ceiling is your top speed. 0 to 15 is obviously start and getting into transitional acceleration. But from 15 to 40, you're going to be basically dependent upon, what your top speed is, and you're getting into those top speed mechanics. I say that knowing that, combine time isn't too far around the corner, and everyone always talks about, oh, well, these guys are accelerating all the way through 40. It's an acceleration, race. And I mean, yes, the fastest guys are accelerating all the way through that. But if you don't have a good top speed, you're not going to run a good 40. So
it was interesting in Brian Kula's presentation. He brought up the fact that back in the 80s, that Boyd Epley put out a paper or something saying they tested 40-yard dashes, and then they did no sprinting for like an entire period, 8 to 10 weeks, 12 weeks, something like that. And they tested again. And as a group, they were faster. And you can just imagine what weight room centered people, when they saw that.
So let's look at that financially. Boyd Epley owned part of Hammer Strength. Oh no, he owned part of Nautilus. So would he make any money by coming out and saying we sprinted? No, but if we're all in the weight room, Boyd Epley, who is one of the richest people in the state of Nebraska, makes even more money.
Follow the money.
Follow the money every time. And God forbid, no one would ever guess that the NSCA may just publish some things from their own perspective, an agenda that they want to push. That would never happen. Not from the NSCA.
Well, I wasn't aware of that about Boyd Epley, but one way or another, if you want to follow the money, run a fast 40-yard dash, right?
That's right. That's what it comes down to today. So Ken, along those same lines of what we're talking about here, what should coaches be aware of if they're using research to build training programs?
Yeah, that's another great question. And it's one that I've never actually talked about in, kind of a presentation actually, or a public forum. And happy to discuss it here because it's crucial. Chris Meng, I'll ask you to jump in at the end of this as well, since some of your training with Jordan was based on a little bit, at least on our research this summer. So, first and foremost, I think it's important that coaches are aware of, if it was like a training study, or even if it wasn't, what was the population of in the research? Because they have to make sure that, okay, the population, the subjects, their demographics Were they men? Were they women? What age were they? What sport background? What training status? That sort of thing. If the population doesn't line up with the population of athletes that you're coaching, well, there's no guarantee that the results from the study are going to transfer to the athletes that you're coaching. They might, but if it's a population of recreationally trained 8th graders and you coach varsity collegiate sprinters, well, the results from that study on recreationally trained 8th graders aren't necessarily going to transfer to your varsity collegiate athletes. Vice versa, if it's in elite athletes and you try to make it transfer to a ninth grade track program that you're coaching, you could have some misalignment there. So I think first and foremost is looking at the population that it was done with and making sure that there's some alignment with the population of athletes that you coach. And if there's not, then just taking that research with a grain of salt. I think second of all, some other factors, when looking at research studies, how long was the training study? So a lot of research studies, a lot of training studies, they're really short because that's unfortunately the nature of research. Running training studies is really challenging. Mihal Cahill, did a training study that I know he's going to talk about with you guys tomorrow night. Chris Corfist, I know you've been involved with some training studies that you and I are, involved with Aaron Fieser. I mean, they're challenging. Training studies are really challenging. And sometimes they represent, a real training program, and sometimes they're, more artificial, for lack of a better word. So it's important to, analyze the study and really how much did it really resemble a real training program that you might do with your team. And then I think, just overall, when you're looking at research and saying, is this an important study that I can draw something from? It's just, how well does this apply to my athletes? The amount of training time I have, my population, the mode that I can train my athletes with, that sort of thing. And if those things, don't line up, it doesn't mean it's a bad training study, of course, or a bad research study, but it just means that maybe you have to take the findings with a grain of salt. So I think if I see one mistake being made to a certain extent, it's that research is read and just applied to a given audience without any thought to those questions. Just saying, well, hey, this is what this group found, let's do it with my group, when really that may not be a good idea. It may be a good idea, but it may not be. So just reading it with a critical eye from that standpoint. Chris Meng, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah. So training studies aside, if a coach is looking more like the research that me and Dr. Clark just did, we're not really saying like this is what you need to do to get faster. We're saying like this is what faster athletes are already doing, right? So a faster athlete has a higher thigh angular velocity, right? So intuitively, and what I try to do with Jordan is, okay, how can we overload that variable? What drills can we put her through that will elicit those higher angular velocities than actual sprinting? And we had a hard time finding that. And even if we did find that, the specificity and transfer may not even pan out. So a drill can be really specific and not transfer, or it could be unspecific and still transfer. So whether or not just simply overloading the variable is the way to go, or simply like put it like the exogen or the Lila calf sleeves, if we were to do that, have athletes pulling through with a little more weight, right? Like that could lead to a specific transfer too. So a lot of that definitely comes down to either further research and training studies, like Dr. Clark was saying, or just good coaches experimenting with their groups and kind of seeing either what passes Tony's eye test, or if Chris Corfus likes it, maybe it's good,
So have you guys used the calf sleeves?
No, we don't have a pair.
Chris, Chris and I are involved in some research that is using those currently, I guess you could say, right?
Yeah.
So
I use them.
I think the jury is out from a research standpoint, but it's certainly being used currently, right, Chris? And these studies that are ongoing.
And if you know me, if I didn't like it, it'd be out in the garbage. If I didn't think I was getting something out of it.
Follow the money.
Follow the money. Right.
I want to say a quick funny story to tie things back around. That's how I got involved with Peter Weyand, which is so when a 2000 study came out, my dad read it, and then he emailed Peter Wayne. This is in 2000. My dad was just coaching me and said, well, how do I apply this to my son? And then Peter was like, well, I guess you're just gonna have to figure that out. And so that's how I got linked up with Peter back in 2000. Little did I know that a decade later I'd be, I was when I was 20, and then when I was 30, I went down to study with him. So there's always just this ebb and flow of research coming. Sometimes first, sometimes, great coaches already know these things, but it just takes the research to, quantify or validate it. But there's always just this give and take and ebb and flow of coaches and researchers and athletes, kind of collectively figuring it out.
So Ken, you've been around a lot. You've USATF, you've been around Peter's stuff. I mean, you've been around a lot of athletes, and people have you out. But let's take you out of the scientific mind for a second, because
Sure.
You are a coach, you understand sprinting. So when you see all these people, whether at USATF and you're at the trials and all that stuff, what attributes jump out at you from a coaching perspective and not a scientist perspective? Like, what do you see?
Yeah, gosh, great question. I guess, how many forms fast can take. And what I mean by that is, you go to like a USATF track meet or, Olympics. I mean, in some ways, athletes are all the same. And yet, if you look at the two or three fastest men in the world, the last world championships, you got Bolt, you got Gatlin, and you got Coleman. And I mean, from 6'5" to 5'6", and then it's unbelievable that these guys are all that fast in such different forms and different mechanics and that sort of thing. So I guess that's one of the things that, just from a coaching or even as a fan, frankly, standpoint, that I sit back and I watch and I'm like, man, it's just incredible that this guy can run 9.8 and this other guy can run 9.8, and, they're nearly a foot difference in height, and they're doing some slightly different things mechanically, that sort of thing. So I guess that's one thing that always, jumps out at me, how many, I guess, body shapes can be fast, from the guys that are, a little bit, perhaps you could say, overly muscled and they're just strong and they're applying force in a certain way and good accelerators, to the guys that are just, wired and a Marcellus type, where they are powerful clearly, but it's not coming from a bulky standpoint, right? Where it's just, they're 149 pounds and wired and everywhere in between. And of course there's female examples of that as well. So I guess that would be the thing that, as a coach or just as a fan, kind of the non-scientific attributes jump out at me is, there's these key variables, but there's some different physical profiles that can get to that or allow for that sort of thing.
So where do you think this is all going to go with research? So we've got 3 different body types, but yet they all run 9.8. And this is kind of my obsession with this. What does it take to make anyone get to that level? What do you think the factor is?
Yeah, I mean, it's always
and how and what
right?
research that? I mean, just thinking outside the box for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
well, let me
of course,
rephrase it. You got Jimmy Smith coming in, and you've got a magic wand. You can give him one attribute to make him run sub 10. What are you giving him?
Oh, wow, that's a tough question. So it's so hard that Chris Meng, I'm just going to defer this right to you and not answer it. No, Chris, I'll kick it to you in a second. But yeah, Chris Corfus, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, clearly it's, these guys have to have just incredible genetics. They're all wired. They come in different shapes and sizes. It's like any elite NFL player or anything else. These guys are all just, I mean, at that level, they're all freaks of nature. What to do to take them from a 10-1 to a 9-8, any one specific thing? I guess that's why I'm in this line of work. When I have that answer, I'll let you know. But until then,
Some people
I'm
say
still
steroids.
Yeah, that's right. And the legal thing to go from 10-1 to 9-8, right?
There you go.
So
I guess
That's what.
there's juice in that magic wand then.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Dynamo works.
That's what, that's what I guess makes it interesting for me. I'll say this, and before I kick it to Chris Meng, I see the future. This, I'm not really answering your question here, Chris Corfist. I'm taking it down a different route. I see the kind of the future of where this field goes, though, as more of these, I guess you could call them research coaching collaborations, where researchers working with training groups or teams or whatever. I mean, the training studies are really key, because what I guess I would call acute studies, where we're figuring out the mechanics that are important. I mean, those are really critical groundwork, right? Like, I mean, obviously Peter's papers in 2000 and 2010, I would like to think that we just done helps that understanding as well. But that's the understanding, as Chris Meng already pointed out, that's the understanding of what fast people do. But then it's a secondary level of understanding of how do we get people there. And I think, if you're wearing your research or your science hat, some good training studies that look at those factors and really quantify, well, we did this with this group and it got them X much better. We need more of those. There's not that many out there. It takes progressive coaches. I mean, I know that you guys are two of those coaches, because you were, willing enough to collaborate on that 1080 study. But I mean, it takes progressive coaches that are willing to buy in and get their athletes to buy in to do those sort of things. To me, that's what really is going to take it to the next level. There's more of those studies being done, but they're not that commonplace. And I think that's where we say, that's where we can really take, okay, well, this is what we know is important for people being fast. And now, hey, now we can experiment with some different things and try to identify what works and what doesn't. So sorry, Chris Meng, I hope I didn't steal your thunder, but.
No, that's definitely a tough question. But that is the important question for sure. I think it reminded me of a talk that me and Tony had over the summer when we were working out with Michael Menaker, right? And we ran the numbers on him. He had a stride frequency of like 5 steps per second, which is pretty universally accepted as a physiological limit. So like, you go back to Tony, tell him this, he says like, okay, well, how does he get faster? Like, what's the difference between Michael Menaker and a Christian Coleman? And you laughed, Tony, when I said this, but you said, like, it's nice to have Ken Clark on speed dial. So we gave you a call like at the track. We said, like, from this paper too, to give that another shout out, like Christian Coleman's probably going through a bigger range of motion, right? And he's able to do it in the same amount of time. Yeah. So being able to kind of, I guess, see what's limiting your athletes like that, and see, like, you see this kid like Michael Menaker running 10 meters a second and he has that stride frequency of 5 steps per second. But if he could either slow that down a little bit and maybe work his way back up, right? So increase the range of motion, frequency is going to go down, and then be able to work it back up over time. It's kind of an idea.
Chris, I was going to remember one of the things, the calculations you did about Michael Menaker. I believe you said that if you do the math, he's putting out 23 body weights per second. Remember that?
Yeah, that's the rate of loading.
And I said, well, what in the hell does that mean? You go, I don't know. It's just kind of interesting. Yeah. and what I said was, holy hell, there's nothing in the weight room that you could do. If you did the math, it would be like 3,500 pounds in 1 second, right?
Yeah, definitely nothing specific like that.
Yeah, there's just one of the reasons why sprinting such a good stimulus. No doubt. There's not many things you can do that can match those amounts of force in that short amount of time. So, Chris Corfist, did I successfully duck your question?
That's all right. Someone else finally put a question in the Q&A. Ken, do you use heavy sled resistance training? If you do, how heavy, how often, and at what point in the training cycle? Which I guess
yes, and yes. Because I'm lucky enough. I was friends with Mihal Cahill and was a co-author on those studies that he did for his dissertation. But I'm not going to touch that subject, even though that's a great subject, because that's the focus of Mihal's talk, which I believe is tomorrow night. So I'll leave that for him to discuss, as he's really the expert more so than I am. But yeah, I do believe they have their place, but I'll let those from you all to discuss. Which I guess is a mean way of me saying you have to tune in tomorrow night.
There you go.
Mihal's good. He knows his stuff. He's
also a part of that 1080 study as well.
He was.
So,
that was the three of us that did that
Flew up
together.
from Dallas. Yeah.
And that's when we were calling him Irish Mike, and he used to get so pissed.
I'm not calling him Irish Mike anymore.
So when I went down to New Zealand, that's when he gave his dissertation. So I was calling him Irish Mike to all the people down there, and they started calling him Irish Mike, and he was pissed at me. So then I called him Dr. Irish Mike, and he said, well, I guess I can deal with that, because he just passed his exam or his dissertation thing.
Oh, well, those are great series of questions. I'm trying to thank Chris Corfus from what we talked about this afternoon. Is there anything we didn't? I think we got to almost all of it there. So,
yeah, Chris Meng, when you were talking about your thing, you didn't really explain what you did to improve her rate, or not her rate, but her velocity. It's something with holding a thigh at the ball, but then you just kind of left it hanging.
Yeah, we did
Rookie teacher
for like
move.
frontside mechanics. We did that. We did like the ball drill. You hold a medicine ball on your stomach. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, but that's where you left it, and then you said something about for your angular velocity improvement. You didn't explain that.
well,
Do you know
Chris, I'm not sure you can isolate any one thing that you did, right? I mean, didn't you try a lot of things, and it ultimately, correct me if I'm wrong here, Chris Meng, from the video-based measures you took, it got better, but it was hard to attribute it to any one specific drill that you did. Am I correctly understanding that?
Yeah, definitely. So from the time we tested at Westchester, and from the video that we saw in like Dr. Clark's presentation, that was a year apart, and that was a year of 10-meter flies 3 days a week, kind of like pure speed work there for her. We knew that was like her weakest attribute as an athlete, and especially with the PRs that she had. So she definitely needed that top speed work. And as she got faster and faster, as the flies kept dropping and dropping, like those variables definitely kept going up.
But you also said that she was very awkward in traditional speed drills.
Yeah, definitely. She's laughing over there right now, but she like I said before, like she's definitely a very noodly athlete. Like she wasn't like traditionally that stiff athlete. Like if you looked at her, if you watched her do those drills, like you would have guessed she went 24 flat and 52 in the 400. So she found her way to run, and she was definitely the tall, lanky kind of flow runner, runs with her own momentum, I guess. But yeah, so kind of changing her. It's been interesting. We talked about this the other day, where like she's better at the fast twitch stuff, but she's by no means a twitchy athlete yet, you know. And I don't know if you'll ever expect to see that change, but I mean, that was definitely her weakest link, and we definitely strengthened that a lot. But
that's because she ran like 10,000 miles at Notre Dame, right?
Close to, yeah. That might have been maybe every 2 weeks.
Hey, Chris, now that you're down in Florida, remind me what I lent you so I know what I'm not getting back.
Yeah. So the extra genie is ours. That is our extra genie. We've got the water bag. We've got the free wrap still. So we're using that in the team setting now. What else do we have? I think that's it, right?
How'd you get the water bag down there?
Just put it in the car. We took our car.
You didn't deflate it? You just left it inflated in the car and took up all that space?
No, it was deflated.
Okay.
It doesn't.
Can I give you a pump?
Pump it up every time we use it. You gave us the one.
Just checking so I know if I'm losing my mind. Like if I can't find my free lap, I know where it is now.
Yeah, we got it. We'll keep it safe.
A question. Going back to stiffness, curious if Chris Meng, Coach Hall, or Dr. Clark have used the spring ankle isometrics. If so, when do you apply them in the training session?
Sorry, I'm reading this now. Spring ankle isometrics.
That's the stuff I do with Cal, our spring ankle model with all the isometrics.
Yeah, I'll let you chime in, Chris. I mean, I definitely have done some isometrics. We do iso type stuff with our athletes at Westchester, but Chris Corfus, I'll let you specifically address that.
Well, it's my stuff, so of course I use it.
Well, I'll take the question then. What we do is when we have non-sprint days, we call them X factor days, And in X Factor, it just really gives us a chance to do whatever the hell we want to do. And so that spring ankle stuff is perfect because it doesn't ever ruin the next day. And one of the big things about X Factor for us is that we want to do something after school, but we know we can't sprint 5 days a week after school. And so we're doing something, and we're never going to ruin the next day. That's going to be a sprint day. So that's a great, typically we'll have like 4 stations of maybe 10 to 12 minutes each. And so we will do that spring ankle series as one of our stations. So that's where we put it in. So it's very randomized. I don't believe in periodization at all. We don't have a general prep phase. We don't have the volume phase and all that kind of stuff. We are performance ready every day. We are a performance outfit. So whether we do it early in the season or late, we do it both.
Another question for the group: how does, or maybe perceived hip height, affect the tangential force? Or how does it affect ankle rockers? Some say to run tall, while others talk about more of a squat run.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the run tall camp. So, if you look at some of the best of the best, you look at the guys like Noah Lyles. There's that image, of him the other day. And I know Tony, you posted this, a while ago. Those athletes literally they appear to be, above the ground, and they're striking, aiming to strike underneath them, and hips are tall. I'm not sure that, I would view anything other than that as compressing too much into the ground and potentially decreasing ground contact time. Increasing ground contact time and decreasing speed. I wouldn't view, speaking only about top speed here, I wouldn't view anything other than running tall as being a good thing.
And I've always been the same way, but then I had to sit through Joel Smith's Zoom podcast where he talked about how much faster he got when he got squatty when he ran. And I haven't slept well ever since, because I respect Joel Smith so much that, and Chris, I think you even agreed that for some athletes that getting tall actually interferes with high speed.
Yeah, everyone's different. And I think that's something we have. I think Ken has already talked about it, that here's a 6'5" guy, 6 foot guy, and a 5'8" guy, but yet they all run 9'8". It may work for some people, it may not work for other people. And it depends on where your stiffness comes. It depends on how well your feet are working and how well your ankles are working. And then you have the whole neurologic aspect to it.
So Chris, would you suggest, and seriously, it's probably the thing that's bothered me the most about TFC 2020 is the whole idea of a squatty run, because it just goes against everything I've always taught. I've always been like Ken, run like Carl Lewis. Marcellus, if you're 5'6", run like you're 5'8". So would you suggest that a sprinter try a squatty run once in a while? You wouldn't cue it to your whole group, right?
I don't suggest anything for my sprinters when they sprint at full speed. I'm going to let their body take over what they think is the right thing to do. And again, that's where it gets tricky, because, and we all know this at a track meet, some kid's running and you're screaming, use your arms, Jimmy, use your arms. And they use their arms and then everyone runs by them. Whenever you throw something consciously into the mix, you're wrecking what the body is trying to do. And so it may work for some people, it may not work for other people. I don't know. But I don't cue anything like that. Like run squatted, because like Ken said, if you run squatted too much, you've just dampened the whole system, and you're going to drop the whole thing, and you may not be able to come out of it. So nobody can dictate, the people who are in that camp, how far do you squat? Nobody ever says that. They just say run squatted. And it's, well, that can be a lot of different things. And for some people it may work. And I think it all comes down to what your ankle and feet are doing. And then you've got that neural drive as to what's the body forcing you to do and how bad do you want it, and what do you feel comfortable doing. Some people, once you get into that neural realm of what the body will let you do, I think it changes the whole picture of what's going on. So no, I don't coach anyone to squat when they run. I like that bent knee prime time because I think that's a great way to get a better read on the split. And I think it forces you to absorb that energy better and get a better tangential force. And maybe for some people, if you run squat a little better, you get a better tangential force. Or maybe Joel just needed a change in training because he had been sprinting tall for 20 years. And then all of a sudden you threw a variation into his sprint and it opened up the realm for what's possible. Like his body felt safer because it explored that aspect of running. So you don't know what sets people off when they're running, when they hit PRs. And that's,
I think it's interesting too. I've told people that when you time somebody thousands of times, kids will automatically try things. They will try to run with bigger arms. They will try to run with a longer stride. They will try to increase their free. There's not a whole lot of variables that you can try, but kids will try them. And I think when they run a faster time by trying something, it's it's a voyage of exploration, and they end up getting a little bit faster.
And that's really what good training is, exploring what your body can do. And so you increase the realm of what's possible. And it just raises the ceiling for what you're going to do, which again, I think that's one of the
timing. If you're not timing, you never get that.
Yeah. I think that's one of the fascinations I have with overspeed training. I think that there is a strong vestibular component to sprinting. And if not, show me a kid that has really bad eyesight when they're little, that's fast. You never see the pop bottle glass kid that's 7 or 8. You never see them in the 100. They're the manager or something. There's a barrier that the brain puts up saying, dude, you can't see, so you can't go faster. You're going to run into a tree and a bear is going to eat you. So
I always say
not
too,
going to happen.
That the best sprinters run with a reckless confidence.
Yeah, and I think someone made that the ability of the body to I think Dan Fichter and I were talking about this, the ability that the body can just take in more, that your really great athletes can just take in more than your average athlete. And I think, in my opinion, that's really where the next realm is going, is the neurologic aspect of sprinting. And that's, again, why I like overspeed, is we're increasing the ceiling for what the body says is acceptable. That I'm not getting hurt. I'm running 11 meters a second and I'm not hurt. Maybe I can take some of the governors off. And that's my Bo Jackson theory. I think Bo Jackson was a freak because he had no governors. There was no Golgi tendon apparatus that slowed him down. Because if you watch his 30 for 30, and he lives across the street, I just got to get into the gated community to ask him these questions if I don't get shot by going in there. They tells a story about doing a backflip in waist deep water. Nobody can do that unless you have unlimited potential into your system. That's freakish. And so I think what happened with him is that he was so powerful with no regulation that he broke his hip. A 28, 29-year-old freak like him should not break their hip. Grandma breaks their hip when they're 90, not Bo Jackson. But I think the torque that he was putting, that uninhibited torque that he was putting in his body, broke him. That was his eventual downfall.
Ken, thank you so much.
Pleasure as always. Thank you for having me. TFC is a great event, and I'm always happy to be a part of it. So looking forward to future events, whether it's remote or in person or whatever. So thanks, and thank you, Chris Meng, for joining us as well.
Thanks, Chris.
My equipment down there.
Thanks, guys.